The early years of World War II saw Nazi Germany take control of Europe. By late 1941, as Adolf Hitler continued expanding his empire, events in the Pacific escalated when Imperial Japan and America became embroiled in conflict after the attack on the US naval fleet at Pearl Harbor. As smoke and fire engulfed the naval base in Hawaii, America and its president, Franklin D. Roosevelt, could no longer stay on the sidelines of a war that had been raging in Europe for over 2 years. On December 7th, 1941, the conflict expanded into a truly global war.
A state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
This marked the start of a new phase in the Second World War, with America joining the fight for what Roosevelt defined as the 4 freedoms. First was freedom of speech. Second, freedom of religion and expression. Third, freedom from want. And finally, freedom from fear. The tale of how a nation that valued its neutrality and had worked so hard to avoid war abroad finally joined the fight follows the journey of Roosevelt, the man behind the American dream. Born on January 30th, 1882, in Hyde Park, New York, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was the son of James Roosevelt and Sarah Ann Delano, both from wealthy and well-established New York State families. On his mother's side, Franklin descended from a French pilgrim who attempted the perilous voyage from England to America, sailing near the Mayflower. Delayed by complications en route, Philippe de Lannoy finally reached American shores in 1621. 2 decades later, Claes van Roosevelt, James Roosevelt's ancestor, sailed from Holland and arrived in Nieuwe Amsterdam, modern-day New York. The Roosevelts were a powerful family, and Franklin led a privileged life, studying at one of America's most esteemed universities, Harvard. While there, at the turn of the 20th century, his 5th cousin, Theodore Roosevelt, became president in 1901. Theodore quickly became a hero and role model for the younger Roosevelt, who was inspired by his decisive leadership. Shortly after his cousin took office, Franklin met Theodore's niece, Anna Eleanor Roosevelt, whom he later married in 1905. Eleanor taught Italian and Jewish immigrant children dance in New York's Lower East Side, exposing Franklin to the struggles of America's poor. It was a lesson he never forgot, and together the couple later made significant strides in improving life for the underprivileged. 6 years after marrying Eleanor, Franklin followed in his cousin's footsteps, running for the New York Senate. After a successful campaign, he entered the State House at just 28. When Woodrow Wilson made him Assistant Secretary of the Navy in 1913, Roosevelt formed a lifelong connection with the Navy, becoming a strong proponent of the submarine, which was crucial in countering Germany's growing threat to shipping. World War I began in 1914, but America stayed out until 1917. President Wilson had hoped to maintain peace and avoid exposing Americans to the horrors of trench warfare, which had already turned gruesome. That changed in 1917, when a telegram revealed that Germany was attempting to persuade Mexico to join a military alliance against the United States, promising to return Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. After many sleepless nights, Wilson concluded war was inevitable. On April 6, 1917, the US declared war on Germany, much to Britain's relief. Winston Churchill, First Lord of the Admiralty at the war's outbreak, famously remarked, "There are only two ways of winning the war, and they both begin with an A." One was America, the other air power. It took a year for the US to gather enough strength to make an impact, but by mid-1918, thousands of American troops were arriving in France daily, helping the Allies push the Germans back and forcing them to surrender. During this time, Roosevelt visited the Western Front and Britain, and on July 29, 1918, he met Winston Churchill, then Minister of Munitions, at a banquet in Gray's Inn, London. The encounter was not pleasant for Roosevelt, who later recalled Churchill's rude behavior, saying he acted like a stinker, little suspecting how their relationship would evolve in the future. Just 3 months after Roosevelt's visit, Germany surrendered, and the world rejoiced as the armistice was signed on November 11, 1918. But by then, millions had died. Over 100,000 Americans perished, and more than 200,000 were wounded, leaving many in the US convinced that European affairs should remain European. As America returned to peace, Roosevelt faced a personal crisis. Eleanor discovered his affair with his social secretary, Lucy Mercer, and by 1917, she had moved with their 5 children into a separate home in Hyde Park. However, they overcame the scandal, and as Lucy ended the relationship, Eleanor remained a loyal and devoted wife, later becoming a major political figure herself. As the Roosevelts resolved their personal struggles, post-war America entered an economic boom, with the Roaring Twenties making the country a hub of glamour and excitement. With a thriving economy, more people could afford luxuries like radios and cars, and Hollywood emerged as an iconic part of American culture. Advances in filmmaking made movies more spectacular than ever, giving rise to a new class of celebrities as audiences flocked to see stars like Rudolph Valentino on Broadway and the silver screen. But there was a darker side. Prohibition fueled crime, and gangsters became as famous as Hollywood's brightest stars. Despite America's prosperity, the 1920s proved difficult for Roosevelt. In 1921, while on holiday at Campobello Island with his family, he contracted polio. Suddenly unable to walk, he spent the next 7 years pursuing treatments to regain mobility. Once again, Eleanor fought for him. His mother, Sarah Delano, believed he would be an invalid for life, but Roosevelt and Eleanor refused to accept defeat. Using iron braces on his hips and legs, he taught himself to walk short distances with a cane or an aid.
In not having to carry about 10 pounds of steel round on the bottom of my legs.
His determination was so strong that when he ran for office in 1928, few supporters knew he relied on a wheelchair in private. But just as Roosevelt secured election as governor, America's fortunes took a dramatic turn. The most devastating stock market crash in history shook the nation in October 1929. The Wall Street crash marked the start of a turbulent era that affected the entire world. Unemployment soared, millions lost their homes, and as the glittering 1920s gave way to the Great Depression, the global economy reeled. Germany, already struggling with massive war reparations, plunged into further crisis. Against this backdrop, Roosevelt launched his bid for the presidency in 1932. While America was not at war in the traditional sense, Roosevelt approached the economic crisis like a battlefield commander. I pledge myself to a new deal for the American people. This is more than a political campaign. It is a call to arms. His New Deal was a sweeping set of policies aimed at tackling the crisis, rallying the public to the voting booths. In 1933, a victorious Roosevelt entered the White House, committed to relief for the poor, financial reform, and economic recovery. He introduced the Social Security system, which remains a pillar of American life today, and did everything in his power to lift the country from despair. Unfortunately, Roosevelt was not the only new leader to exploit economic hardship for political gain. And far from the US West Coast, German citizens listened intently to the speeches of a fervent new leader, Adolf Hitler. He not only promised economic recovery, but also retribution against those he deemed responsible for Germany's suffering following the First World War. Unlike Roosevelt's altruistic reforms, Hitler pursued self-aggrandizement and vengeance, blaming Jews and communists for Germany's downfall and mobilizing violent Nazi forces for their eradication. Across the Atlantic, these developments largely escaped American notice, but soon, they too would confront the horrors of war. Globally, unrest escalated, particularly in 1935, when Italian dictator Mussolini invaded Abyssinia, now Ethiopia. A year later, amid fierce Spanish Civil War battles, Congress sought to assure the American public of non-involvement, leading to the Neutrality Act's passage. Meanwhile, unemployment declined, the economy stabilized, and Roosevelt's popularity secured his 1937 re-election. Yet, international tensions deepened as Japan invaded China, prompting an exodus of Americans from Shanghai. Roosevelt responded with aid and, on October 5, 1937, delivered a speech at odds with US isolationism. The peace, freedom, and security of 90% of the world is endangered by 10%, threatening the collapse of law and order. We seek to avoid war, yet cannot ensure against its effects. His words suggested that, for Roosevelt, war might be inevitable. By 1938, Europe's instability worsened as the Nazis seized Austria, the Rhineland, and Czechoslovakia, facing minimal resistance from war-weary Britain and France. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, prioritizing peace, struggled with how to confront Hitler. Roosevelt, meanwhile, faced Chamberlain's disdain for Americans, whom he saw as brash and unmannered. Repeated White House invitations were declined, straining US-UK relations. Ironically, Chamberlain found Hitler more approachable, even traveling to Germany for appeasement talks as the first Nazi rally was broadcast to millions of Americans. Hitler's shrieking rhetoric and the Nazis' regimented Sieg Heil chants alarmed Roosevelt, who saw war as inevitable. Shocking news arrived just 2 months later. The November 1938 Kristallnacht pogrom. Outraged, Roosevelt publicly condemned Germany's actions. The past day's news has shocked American opinion. I could scarcely believe such things could happen in the 20th century. As the world recoiled from Nazi brutality and Hitler's defiance of the Versailles Treaty, Roosevelt sought clarity on his ambitions. In April 1939, he telegrammed Hitler, demanding assurances that Germany had no intention of invading 31 nations, questioning why the Nazis resorted to tactics reminiscent of the Huns and Vandals 1,500 years earlier. A copy was sent to Mussolini, and the message was broadcast in America, hoping to sway public sentiment. Hitler's response was a furious 2-hour speech, denying aggressive intent while launching a scathing attack on Roosevelt. Hitler's duplicity was evident, but Roosevelt could do little beyond watching and waiting. Despite strained US-UK relations, Roosevelt sought to strengthen ties by hosting King George VI and Queen Elizabeth in June 1939. Their visit bolstered Britain's image in America as they toured the New York World's Fair and the First World War's Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. However, both Roosevelt and the King understood Hitler's looming threat. As the royal couple departed, Roosevelt wished them well, but just 11 weeks later, Britain was at war. On September 1st, 1939, Roosevelt was awoken by a call from the US ambassador in Warsaw. Germany had invaded Poland. Understanding the gravity of this act, Roosevelt simply responded, "God help us all." Two days later, Britain and France declared war, marking the start of a 6-year global conflict.
I am speaking to you from the Cabinet Room at 10 Downing Street. This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by the war would be finished. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
Though Roosevelt assured Americans of neutrality, he urged them not to remain neutral in thought. However, most Americans opposed European intervention, sympathizing with Britain and France, but considering it their problem.
I say we ought to keep hands off. Let them take care of themselves. You can count me out.
Yet, Anglo-American relations found an unexpected savior in Winston Churchill. Reappointed First Lord of the Admiralty the day war was declared. Despite past tensions, Roosevelt eagerly corresponded with Churchill, relieved to find a proactive ally in Chamberlain's government. While Roosevelt's neutrality declaration kept America officially out of war, covert preparations began. In October 1939, leading Americans convened in Panama, establishing a security zone extending miles into the sea. That same month, Albert Einstein, a refugee from Nazi Germany, warned Roosevelt of Germany's nuclear ambitions, prompting the formation of an advisory committee on uranium. Meanwhile, European nations continued to fall under Nazi control, and America observed Britain and France's ineffectual attempts to halt German advances into Denmark and Norway, while Stalin's Red Army marched into Finland. Reports of Jewish persecution also intensified. Writers like John Steinbeck and Eugene O'Neill condemned Nazi anti-Semitism, joined by Hollywood stars Fred Astaire and Bette Davis. By June 1940, Nazi forces had stormed through Holland, Belgium, and into France, leading to Neville Chamberlain's resignation. On May 10, 1940, Winston Churchill became Britain's wartime Prime Minister. As Paris fell, Churchill appealed to Roosevelt. The US voice and power may count for nothing if delayed too long. With Hitler targeting Britain, Churchill desperately requested American military aid, especially following the Dunkirk evacuation's heavy equipment losses in May-June 1940. Though Roosevelt provided Churchill's requests, he doubted even Churchill's rousing speeches could sustain British morale against Nazi aggression. However, Churchill's decisive attack on the French fleet at Oran, preventing its capture by Germany, impressed Roosevelt. He responded by offering Churchill 50 destroyers in exchange for 99-year leases on British Caribbean and Newfoundland bases. Yet, while Roosevelt was willing to help, the American public remained unconvinced. Charles Lindbergh, aviation hero and staunch isolationist, led the America First movement, arguing against US involvement. Having visited Germany in the 1930s and received an award from Luftwaffe commander Hermann Göring, Lindbergh viewed Soviet Russia as a greater threat than Hitler and feared a European crusade would doom Western civilization. His stance found support among prominent businessmen, authors, and celebrities, including Walt Disney and actress Lillian Gish. Even future President John F. Kennedy sent Lindbergh a telegram of support. Convinced of Lindbergh's Nazi sympathies, Roosevelt ordered an FBI investigation, but no incriminating evidence surfaced. As Roosevelt struggled against public opposition, Hitler unleashed the Luftwaffe on Britain. Millions of Americans followed events via radio broadcasts, captivated by the Battle of Britain. Journalist Edward Murrow played a key role in bringing the Blitz into American homes, reporting live from London's rooftops amid bombs and air raid sirens, even capturing the hurried footsteps of civilians fleeing to shelters. At a time when survival was uncertain from one day to the next, "So long and good luck" became the standard British farewell. This soon found its way into Murrow's programs, as he concluded each broadcast with the poignant phrase, "Good night and good luck." Americans were visibly moved by Britain's plight, and public sentiment slowly shifted. Some refused to wait for a change in US foreign policy and risked everything to fight for freedom long before such selfless service was requested. Between June 1940 and December 41, several hundred Americans volunteered for the RAF, helping defend Britain in the Battle of Britain. Fighter pilots, navigators, and air gunners faced a 10-year prison sentence, loss of US citizenship, and a $20,000 fine under American law. Many brave volunteers claimed to be Canadian to avoid discovery. Some perished in battle and were among the few the British owed their lives to. As Britain fought on, Roosevelt prepared at home with the Selective Service Act, requiring all men aged 21 to 36 to register. However, over 6,000 local draft boards decided fitness and deferment claims. While men queued for examination, Roosevelt reassured the public, insisting he wouldn't send Americans into a European war, framing it as preparation for national defense. He couldn't afford to lose public favor. He had an election to win. After 2 terms, Roosevelt pursued a third, an unprecedented move in US presidential history. Out of 48 states, he won all but 10, with 27 million voters returning him to the White House in November 1940. As Roosevelt presided over Congress, he remained determined to aid Britain, describing the US as an arsenal for democracy. His uplifting speech in early 1941 became synonymous with the American dream. In his State of the Union address, he proposed 4 essential human freedoms: freedom of speech and expression, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. A world built on these freedoms, Roosevelt believed, was the antithesis of the so-called New Order of Tyranny. Principles worth fighting for at any cost. Roosevelt soon had his chance to act when, 1 month later, Churchill made a passionate appeal. Give us the tools, and we will finish the job. In response, in March of 1941, Congress passed Roosevelt's Lend-Lease Act, which did exactly as Churchill requested. By then, Britain had fought relentlessly for 9 months and desperately needed supplies. Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson told the Senate, "We are buying, not lending. We are buying our own security while we prepare." The Lend-Lease policy proved invaluable to the Allies, later extending to Russia as Hitler turned on Stalin. By mid-1941, the US was committed to aiding the Allies short of war. US convoys protected Allied shipping, and US aircraft carriers secretly ferried British fighter planes to Mediterranean war zones, escalating the conflict globally. As Europe and America drew battle lines, Japan became an increasing threat in the Southern Hemisphere, triggering dramatic shifts in US foreign policy. When Japan invaded French Indochina, US aid routes to China were at risk, and American Pacific territories faced encirclement. The Philippines, American since Spain's defeat in the late 19th century, were in jeopardy. A historic 1935 meeting between Roosevelt and Filipino President Manuel Quezon had set a path to independence by 1945. But with Japan advancing, the small nation faced grave danger, and Roosevelt's response set in motion events that would change the war's course. In July 1941, Roosevelt froze all Japanese assets in the US. Britain and the Netherlands followed, making it nearly impossible for Japan to buy oil, essential for expansion. Since America supplied 95% of Japan's oil, the embargo was catastrophic. In response, on the 14th of August 1941, Roosevelt and Churchill met face to face, their past differences set aside. "At long last, Mr. President," Churchill exclaimed, shaking Roosevelt's hand. It was their first meeting since 1918 and marked the beginning of a great friendship. Their 4-day meeting aboard a ship off Newfoundland focused on war aims, resulting in the Atlantic Charter. This historic agreement declared that neither the United States nor the United Kingdom sought territorial gains. Churchill deeply respected Roosevelt, later saying, "I felt I was in contact with a very great man who was also a warm-hearted friend and the foremost champion of the high causes which we served." Still, the meeting did not bring America into the war as Stalin and Churchill had hoped. Yet for Japan, the Atlantic Charter and the oil embargo were seen as a declaration of war. Facing existential threats, Japan held an imperial conference in Tokyo in September 1941, attended by the emperor and senior officials. Hitler was eager to pursue his European ambitions, but anything that delayed US involvement was beneficial. He encouraged Japan to attack British-occupied Singapore and India to divert America's attention from Europe. Consequently, Hitler pledged to declare war on America if Japan acted, a move that ultimately proved disastrous for him. He believed America, with prominent pro-Nazi figures like Lindbergh and a public favoring neutrality, wouldn't pose a threat. It was a serious miscalculation. Meanwhile, US-Japanese peace talks baffled the German ambassador, who doubted their sincerity. The US offered Japan a final peace deal, promising to lift embargoes on oil and steel if Japan withdrew from Indochina. Prime Minister Konoe offered to meet Roosevelt in Hawaii, despite the risks. He even proposed a pact under which Japan would avoid war with America, even if US actions led to war with Germany, violating the tripartite pact with Hitler and Mussolini. But Konoe's efforts failed. The Japanese military was set on war. On the 7th of December 1941, Japan sent notification that all negotiations had collapsed. By the time it reached the White House, Roosevelt and the American people already knew peace was no longer an option. At 8 a.m. on Sunday, 7th December, as the Hawaiian sun shone lazily over the Pacific, a sinister shadow emerged on the horizon. Swarms of Japanese fighter planes approached Pearl Harbor. Before sailors could mount a defense, explosions and gunfire shattered the morning calm. Bombs, torpedoes, and bullets devastated the US naval force. Amid the smoke and chaos, thousands of military personnel and civilians perished. Roosevelt now had the mandate to lead America into war. Speculation remains that the attack was not entirely a surprise to him when news of the carnage arrived. By the next morning in Washington, thousands had gathered outside the White House, awaiting Roosevelt's response to the horrific attack. His words would be etched into history, as would the event itself, and he did not disappoint the Allies, rallying his arsenal of democracy to take up arms against the empire of the rising sun.
And dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
On December the 8th, Roosevelt declared that the United States had suddenly and deliberately been attacked by Japan's naval and air forces, and no matter how long it took, America would defend itself to the utmost, ensuring this act of treachery would never again threaten the USA. Roosevelt's fiercest critics now favored war, and the nation, which had long upheld neutrality, united behind the president as America entered the Second World War.
Battles on the continent of Europe, and the Japanese on the continent of Asia and in the islands of the Pacific.
Yet even as Roosevelt spoke, thousands of miles away, the Philippines suddenly came under Japanese attack, and it fell to Field Marshal Douglas MacArthur to lead American and Filipino troops who fought together to defend these strategically vital islands. Aligned with Japan, the Axis Pact now drove Germany and Italy to declare war on America on December the 11th. And as the USA joined the Allies, Churchill was eager to meet Roosevelt to discuss war plans. Just before Christmas 1941, the two great leaders met again, and within the White House, Churchill created his own war room, covering the walls with maps as British administrators filled the corridors. During the Arcadia Conference, Roosevelt and Churchill strategized their next moves, forming an informal alliance between the USA, Great Britain, China, and the Soviet Union. Their objectives were to halt German advances in Russia and North Africa, launch a Western European invasion to crush Germany between two fronts, while also aiding China and defeating Japan. Christmas Eve 1941 would be the only occasion Roosevelt and Churchill addressed the public together, united in their pledge to fight for a free and decent world, and to remember those serving in the armed forces. Fine sentiments indeed, but in the Pacific, the battle was relentless. Hong Kong fell to the Japanese on Christmas Day, followed quickly by Manila, the capital of the Philippines, though fierce fighting continued for 4 months. The Japanese also advanced towards Malaya and the Dutch East Indies at an alarming pace. Nevertheless, for Churchill and Britain, America's entry into the war was a great advantage. By January 1942, American soldiers began arriving in Britain, with numbers increasing dramatically in the years ahead. The American GIs made a significant impact on British life, arriving with gifts for women, particularly stockings, leading disgruntled British men to describe them as oversexed, overpaid, and over here. However, the Americans responded with a jibe at Britain's famously unorthodox commander, Bernard Montgomery, saying the Tommies were undersexed, underpaid, and under Monty. Although many American troops were stationed in Britain, the majority at this time were sent to the Pacific to counter Japan's ongoing assault. In early 1942, the Japanese began bombing Singapore, one of the British Empire's key commercial and military centers. On February the 8th, 23,000 Japanese troops stormed the island, and to Churchill's horror, Singapore fell by February the 15th, which he called Britain's greatest defeat. In the Pacific, American General Dwight D. Eisenhower did all he could to get aid to the struggling Philippines, but failed. The presidential palace in Manila was occupied, and with 80,000 prisoners of war captured, horrifying reports of their brutal treatment soon reached the USA. Filipino and American troops were forced to march 105 kilometers to a prison camp in the north, an ordeal now known as the Bataan Death March. An estimated 10,000 Filipinos and 1,200 Americans died en route from starvation, thirst, and torture. The American press widely reported the atrocity, sparking outrage. Within months, the Japanese controlled Burma, Malaya, Thailand, French Indochina, and the Malay archipelago. The Philippines president and his cabinet fled to Washington to form a government in exile. While war raged in the Pacific, Eisenhower was appointed head of the European Theater of Operations, his first mission being to implement Operation Torch. Devised by Roosevelt and Churchill, the plan aimed to seize French North Africa as a base to drive Italy out of the war. From Gibraltar, Eisenhower directed Operation Torch, targeting Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia, marking the first major joint operation between American and British forces. It was also where Eisenhower encountered General Bernard Montgomery, affectionately called Monty by his men. By February 1943, Eisenhower was made responsible for the British Eighth Army under Montgomery's command, revealing tensions not only between British and American troops, but also at the highest ranks. Montgomery frustrated the Americans by disregarding strategies that didn't suit him, leading to clashes with US Generals George Patton and Omar Bradley. Although Bradley remained courteous, Patton was as contentious as Montgomery, earning the nickname Old Blood and Guts from his troops. On one occasion, Eisenhower had to intervene to save Patton's career. While visiting wounded American soldiers in hospital, Patton shocked onlookers by slapping two young privates, accusing them of cowardice. Though their injuries were invisible, they were suffering from shell shock, now known as post-traumatic stress. Public outcry led many to demand Patton's resignation, but on Eisenhower's advice, he apologized before being temporarily relieved of duty, later returning as a key general in Europe's liberation. Following victory in North Africa, Eisenhower led forces into Italy, which soon fell to the Allies. By 1943, Roosevelt and Churchill, recognizing Eisenhower's tactical brilliance, placed him in charge of Operation Overlord, the European invasion beginning with D-Day. Eisenhower was tasked with organizing 1 million combat troops and 2 million support personnel. On the 6th of June, 1944, the Normandy beaches, Sword, Juno, Gold, Omaha, and Utah witnessed the beginning of World War II's final chapter. By early 1945, victory was inevitable for the Allies. It was just a matter of time. However, for Roosevelt, fate had a cruel twist in store for the man who had done so much to defeat Hitler's axis of evil. On March the 30th, 1945, Roosevelt traveled to Warm Springs to rest before attending the founding conference of the United Nations. On April the 12th, he was taken to his bedroom with a severe headache and died later that day from a massive cerebral hemorrhage. Less than a month later, on May the 8th, 1945, America and Europe celebrated Roosevelt's long-fought victory as Germany surrendered. In the United States, VE Day celebrations were dedicated to Roosevelt's memory, with flags kept at half-mast for a 30-day mourning period. Churchill hailed him as the greatest American friend and the greatest champion of freedom. It was the end of an era, and a new age was beginning. The man who now carried Roosevelt's arsenal of democracy forward was Vice President Harry S. Truman, who would lead America through the war's final chapters. The conflict in the Pacific ended in August 1945 with atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The West rejoiced at peace, but the devastation in the East marked the dawn of a new era in warfare as history's deadliest weapon finally forced Japan's surrender.